Hello, class. Professor Vanderbilt back. I got one more lecture in me today. And we're first going to talk about the great Andrew Carnegie. Now, your textbook has a section devoted to Andrew Carnegie on page 596. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Andrew Carnegie's life in a little more detail than your book does. Andrew Carnegie really, I suppose we could say, is what the American dream is all about. Back in the Gilded Age, the American dream was that an immigrant could come to America with nothing and with some hard work and determination could be successful beyond their wildest imagination. And that's Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie immigrated to the United States and Scotland from Scotland in 1848 at age 12. His family was extremely poor. They spent everything they had just getting here from Scotland. So, which was routine at the time, to make ends meet, 12-year-old Andrew Carnegie immediately had to go get a job like everybody else in his family so they could afford to live here. There was no such thing as child labor laws in 1848, so little kids could work in factories. Andrew Carnegie got a job in a mill that manufactured clothing as a bobbin boy. These were jobs they gave to little boys because they'd run around from machine to machine replacing bobbins of thread in them. So Andrew Carnegie enters the American industrial world at age 12, and he was making $1.20 a week. So he will ultimately, in the late 1860s, move to Pittsburgh, and he'll get a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. He'll initially be employed in their telegraph office. We talked about how every railroad station had a telegraph office. He'll work his way up the ladder in the Pennsylvania Railroad Company as a brilliant young man. And ultimately, in 1872, because of what he saw was going on in the railroad industry, will venture out on his own and start Carnegie Steel Corporation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Carnegie, knowing that all the railroad companies were following Vanderbilt's lead and shifting to steel rails, that there was going to be a tremendous amount of money in steel production. So, Carnegie will get some influential, wealthy people in Pittsburgh to back him because he had built up a great deal of respect for his abilities. And some famous Pittsburgh families like the Frick family and the Schwab family, who you probably all heard of Charles Schwab Investments. Well, there was a Charles Schwab, and he did invest in Carnegie Steel in 1872 to back him. And he's going to produce Carnegie will create over time a what your book calls vertical integration, but what is better explained, as far as I'm concerned, as a trust. Carnegie Steel was a trust. Now, when you form a trust back in this day and age, and it was perfectly legal, there were no laws against it. Later, there'll be antitrust laws. You own every aspect of the operation from beginning to end. So let me explain to you what Carnegie did. He will end up, once he starts to become successful with the steel mills, he'll buy the raw products. He'll buy iron ore mines up in the Great Lakes region, specifically the Lake Superior region in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin area. There's a lot of iron ore mines up there. So, his steel mills will be using the iron ore, the base product for steel, one of them, that comes right from his iron ore mines that his miners are pulling out of the earth. They'll take that iron ore and put it on Great Lake freighters, which are big ships that still exist today and sail on the Great Lakes with cargo. Carnegie will own his own line of Great Lake freighters that will ferry the iron ore from Lake Superior down to Lake Erie, where it will go on one of his own private rail lines to Pittsburgh to his steel mills. So not only does he own the iron ore mines, he owns transportation to get it to his steel mills in Pittsburgh. Another main ingredient of steel is coal. Andrew Carnegie will buy coal mines in Pennsylvania. So his miners will mine the coal he needs for his steel mills, put it on trains that he owns, ferry it to Pittsburgh, and make the end product steel. So he eliminates all the middlemen, so to speak. He owns every aspect of the process, which translates into making tremendous amounts of money. Later on, trusts like this will be deemed illegal in the 20th century and forced to break up through antitrust lawsuits and whatnot. Now, so Andrew Carnegie, by the time, we're approaching, the turn of the century, 1900 or whatever, his steel trust has grown so tremendously in the last 28 years since 1872 when he formed it. His share of the profits, because remember, there were like 40 partners that backed him originally and owned shares of the original company. Carnegie's shares of Carnegie Steel earned him by 1900 a profit that he puts in his pocket of $40 million a year. So Andrew Carnegie, in the matter of 52 years, goes from making $1.20 a week as a bobbin boy at age 12 to making $40 million a year with Carnegie Steel. And in fact, by 1900, Carnegie Steel controls 1/4 of the entire nation's steel production. So, in 1901, he's made an offer he can't refuse. He's getting up there in age. It's time to consider retirement, especially when you got that kind of money. So he's going to sell his share of Carnegie Steel Corporation to the financier J.P. Morgan, who we'll be talking about later on in class, for $400 million. That's Carnegie's share of the sale of Carnegie Steel. J.P. Morgan's in the process of putting together the largest and first billion-dollar corporation in American history, U.S. Steel Corporation, that he forms in 1901. So, now, on top of all the money he's amassed before that, $400 million drops in Carnegie's lap. Luckily for us, as he gets up there in age, even though he was a pretty ruthless businessman, he's also going to have a heart of gold. And Carnegie is going to decide that out of that $400 million that he just received for the sale of Carnegie Steel, he's going to set out to give away $350 million to America. Now, he's going to do this in many methods. One thing that he's going to do is he's going to build libraries across America. Carnegie knew the importance of education, the importance of reading, and he also realized that libraries were very expensive places to have, especially at the turn of the century. And a lot of really, small cities couldn't afford to have a public library. They couldn't afford the building, the employees, the books on the shelves, and so forth, so they didn't have one. So Carnegie starts the Carnegie Library system, where a city that didn't have a library, public library could apply to him, and he would build them a library and fill it with books. Then it'd be their responsibility to run it from that point forward. But that was a big obstacle. He's going to build 1,400 libraries across America, including one in my old hometown of Port Huron. We had a Carnegie library there. And that's the kind of size town, a town of back then in the early 20th century of about 25,000 people, but they couldn't afford to have a library until Carnegie built them one. And it was a really grand building, which today is the Museum of Art and History in my hometown, and they built a different library. But that building, that Carnegie Library, still exists. Another thing that Carnegie did was create a pension fund for school teachers. Back at the turn of the century, K through 12 school teachers were typically women who were paid practically nothing, had no retirement system, and many of them could never afford to retire. They didn't make enough money to save money to retire. Remember, there's no such thing as Social Security. They had no pension, so they'd literally work themselves to death in the classroom. Andrew Carnegie thought that was a crime. So he created a pension system for teachers so they could retire in grace. And this is how a lot of these ladies back towards the beginning of the 20th century could then retire. That transformed itself into an organization known as TIAA. Teachers Insurance Annuity, whatever it is. I don't know, but I'm a member. I had the option to join that instead of the New York State retirement system, and I joined TIAA when I first was employed at Clinton Community College 30 years ago. That's where my retirement rests, in TIAA. And there are, thousands of mainly now college professors and administrators who have their retirement in TIAA, and they manage all of our retirement accounts. And I forget, it's worth, the amount of money that's in it nationwide now exceeds $1 trillion. So I don't worry about my money. It's in good hands. They know what to do with it, and it's not going anywhere. I don't have to worry about a politician spending it all and deciding later on you don't get a retirement like they have in some states. Not that New York would do that, but it's happened in Michigan and Wisconsin. My money is secure in TIAA, and I don't have to worry about somebody else deciding what my retirement funds will be. Thanks to Andrew Carnegie. Thank you, Andrew. Now, he also created a gift to New York City, which some of you may be familiar with. Carnegie Hall was his gift to New York City. He created a university in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, with one of his business partners, Andrew Mellon's family. And he also created, upon his death, the Carnegie Foundation, which still funds educational activities of colleges and universities with grants all across the world. And the Carnegie Foundation has an endowment established by Carnegie upon his death that they'll be spending forever, similar to the Stanford Endowment. So Andrew Carnegie, who we'll be talking about in the future in the 20th century and some other things he does, luckily, in the end run, was not a robber baron and had a heart of gold. Now, on the other hand, let's talk about a robber baron. That's John D. Rockefeller. Now, your book has a section devoted to Rockefeller on page 599. And one of the terms they use to explain how he amassed his fortune is horizontal expansion. A simpler term for horizontal expansion is forming a monopoly or monopolizing a segment of a given industry. Where in stark contrast, Carnegie had a trust. He controlled steel production from beginning to end and all the raw materials. John D. Rockefeller will make his fortune off of oil. But that doesn't mean he owns a whole bunch of oil wells all over the place and is exploring for oil. He will focus on one specific segment of the oil industry, refining. So let me just tell you a little bit about the evolution of the oil industry and how Rockefeller's going to make all this money. The very first commercial oil well in America was drilled in 1859 by a gentleman by the name of Edwin Drake. And when he drilled that well, a lot of people said, for what? What the hell is he going to do with oil? The only real uses for it at that point was a lubricant for machinery, and this is at the beginning of the second industrial revolution. So there wasn't a giant demand for oil. Very quickly, it was discovered, though, that oil that's being pumped out of the initial oil fields in America were in Pennsylvania and Ohio, not Texas and California and Oklahoma and Alaska like today. Those oil fields in Pennsylvania and Ohio have all been basically played out. So they discovered pretty quickly, though, that oil can be refined into kerosene. And that is where John D. Rockefeller is going to make his money. Because there's going to end up being a big demand for kerosene. And here's how it all played out. Back in the day before electric lights, and Edison, remember, didn't even invent them to 1877, people used to have these oil lamps that they lit their homes with, known as hurricane lamps, with the big globe on them and so forth. Initially, these oil lamps burned a fuel, unfortunately, produced from whales. The great whaling fleets, if you've ever read Moby Dick, were out there killing whales mainly for their blubber. And they'd take the blubber and refine that down into whale oil, and that's what people burned in an oil lamp. Well, back in the 1860s, whales are stressed, just like they are today. Some of them are on the verge of extinction. Whale oil prices go through the roof. So it's quickly discovered you can take oil out of the earth, refine it into kerosene, and burn that in oil lamps. Creates a huge demand for kerosene. That's where Rockefeller comes in. In 1870, John D. Rockefeller organizes Standard Oil Company of Ohio in his hometown of Cleveland. In a very short period of 7 years, by 1877, John D. Rockefeller will control 95% of all the oil refining capacity in America. So, by 1877, they used to sell kerosene in 5-gallon tins. You, in all likelihood, when you purchased a 5-gallon tin of kerosene, it said Standard Oil Company of Ohio on it. It was Rockefeller's kerosene. He made a tremendous amount of money off of the sale initially of kerosene. Then obviously as time goes on, Standard Oil will transform itself into gasoline, airplane fuel, you name it. But initially it's all made off kerosene. When John D. Rockefeller retires and hands the business over to his son, John D. Jr., his company will be worth $900 million. That's in a period of 27 years he builds it into that. On kerosene, because remember, there are no cars or airplanes. But he was a robber baron. He was a cheapskate. He didn't give away his money to charity. Give you an example of what he thought charity was. He lived in Cleveland. He was a deeply religious man. And, a couple days a week, he used to do the following. He used to go on long walks. And on some of these days, his first stop would be at the bank. he would go into the bank and get several rolls of dimes. Then he got the biggest kick of going into a playground or a city park where there are a bunch of kids, and he'd have both pockets filled with dimes. He'd take the dimes by the handful and throw them into crowds of kids who would all pile on each other, scrambling to get a dime here or there. He thought that was the greatest thing, but he also believed that was charity, believe it or not. Rockefeller was cheapskate. He'll leave his fortune to his children. Like I said before, there are Rockefellers in New York, down in West Virginia, and other places still spending the Rockefeller fortune. But luckily, after John D. Sr. dies, John D. Jr. was a different person. He was a charitable man. He created the Rockefeller Foundation, which funds all sorts of research and so forth, and created charities, which I'm sure made his father, John D. Sr., spin in his grave, because he's the classic example of a robber baron in the Gilded Age. So, that's where we'll stop today. Either tomorrow or the next day, I'll pick up with some more material. We'll wrap up industry. Then we'll be moving into the American West and what happened out there in the Gilded Age. So I'll talk to you soon. I'm losing my voice. Everybody be safe, wear your masks, and study hard. Bye now.